Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyourear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Welcome to another Word in Your Ear. All authors hope that some news event might assist the timing of their new book, and the sky must have been, let's be honest, black with hats at Miranda Sawyer's publishers when Uncommon People, Britpop and Beyond in 20 songs was preceded by the gold rush for the Oasis reunion. What perfect timing. Fantastic. Miranda, it's lovely to see you again. Where do we find you?
You find me in my sitting room because, look, here it is, look.
Very nice.
Very nice.
Fine. But because I have an office, I'm quite happy to see your office, Mark, because your office is quite akin to mine, but mine is such a tip. Like,
mine's
it's so
a total
bad
tip.
because of writing the book, actually, and it's just a complete tip, and I can't go in it anymore because it makes me want to cry.
I feel very similar. Very similar. But I have to say, the whole thing about Oasis, I thought of you, and I thought that, does it feel like the mid-90s has been officially rebooted? It does to some extent, doesn't it?
Yeah, slightly. I mean, I do think there's slightly that. I mean, I think my publishers were thinking 30 years, if you think kind of 94 was kind of Blur and then 95 was Oasis. So they probably had that in their head a bit, I think, when they were kind of saying, oh, you know, what do you think of a Britpop book? And I thought, okay, fine. But with Oasis, yeah, I mean, I did feel like that's just mad. But also it's, you know, if you are a band like Oasis and you are going to bother to come back together, I mean, why not wait until the publishing reverts to you? And then B, maybe get your divorce over and done with so that when you've done your gigs, you know, the money is just coming to you and nowhere else. And C, why not kind of, like, you know, why not coincide it with 30 years since Definitely Maybe? And, you know, it's kind of all makes sense.
There is also that theory that we've discussed on the podcast in the past from, what's the name of the bloke who wrote the book about ACT coming back, Mark? I can't remember. The idea that your fans aren't interested in you when you're there in their 30s, but when they get a bit older and the children can be left or whatever, or teenagers, that's when they want to go out and celebrate their youth all over again. Is that
also,
true?
Yeah, I think that's true. Also, there's an acknowledgement, like, I think, and this happens with acts as well. So you don't really want to be defined by an era in your life. You feel like, but I'm so much more than that. You know, I'm not just
I'm so much more.
You know what I mean? You know, I'm not just that era when everyone thought I was great. Listen to, you know, if you're an act, it's like listen to the new stuff. But it's also, it's very personal, isn't it? You don't want to feel like your best days are behind you. That's a kind of horrible feeling. And I think you can struggle with that in your 30s and 40s. And then when you hit your kind of 50s, you're a bit like, I can't believe I had such a good time.
Absolutely.
Well done, me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well done, me. That was great. I think, you know, if people like it, I feel really chuffed.
This is really true. Funny. People who are older, musicians, Mark and I talk to a lot of musicians, I got 50, 60, 70 or whatever. They're immensely grateful. They're immensely grateful that anybody's interested at all. They don't have the same attitude that they had in their 30s and 40s.
And that those people have come back who liked them 30 years ago, they brought their kids this time. There's a lovely point in your book, I think it might be in the intro, where you talk about your daughter asking if you'd ever heard of Blur. How old's your daughter now?
She just turned 14.
I thought it was fantastic. Don't you think it's extraordinary that that time that we lived through in our 20s or whatever, in your case, you know, has now become period drama and history? It does seem extraordinary.
The other thing I think, because I think when we were working on music papers in that time, like, so in the, you know, the 80s, the 90s really, I suppose, there's two kind of factors. One, that we didn't realise it was like an absolute high point for magazines, music magazines in general, and that leads to its own kind of hype and scene. But also, I think we had an ability, because we were working in music magazines, to kind of make sense of music. So you could the old idea, white guy idea that you would start off with Elvis, go through the Stones and the Beatles, through punk and out. Do you know what I mean? That idea, that kind of lineage. We could make sense of it like that. And you could then say in music magazines, this, if you like the Byrds, you might like the Stone Roses or whatever, you could make that kind of sense. Whereas now, of course, if you're my daughter, she gets a lot of stuff from TikTok, and my son used to get stuff from computer games, and I would never try and influence them because I always think pop music should be for you. Like, I'm not going to make you a playlist and insist that you must learn my music. It's kind of rubbish. So the stuff arrives at them, but there's no context.
There's no chronology at all.
Yeah.
No chronology, no context. And so suddenly, you kind of get this thing, and like, she's got, she loves Mazzy Star. And they all love Mazzy Star. They're obsessed with Mazzy Star. It's like so
and
many
how,
more.
And how long ago is Mazzy Star? Come on, what is it? Is it 30 years?
Well, it's 30 years, a little bit more, I would say.
To them, it's contemporary. It's now, isn't it? They've just discovered it.
They just like it. And so she'll play stuff in the car, and she'll play, Charlie XCX and Billie Eilish and, all sorts of kind of people from now. But then the Smiths will pop up, or The Cure, or Blur, or whatever. And it just makes me laugh. I quite like it. Yeah. Eminem,
Yeah.
So what's the time frame for the book? I think you talk about it starting with the Yanks Go Home select cover. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Andrew Harrison.
When everyone's April 93 and going on, I think, to, was it Oasis? And
so the original
Why did you choose that?
Okay, so the original idea was that kind of, if you talk to people from that time, like particularly people like Andrew Harrison, he'll go, it started with the Britpop cover.
Yes, he will.
And it ended with the second side of What's the Story?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's very specific, which is the kind of thing that music journalists love to be. And so I started off with that. And then I thought, actually, that doesn't quite work, because I wanted
We should maybe remind people of that cover, actually, because anybody watching or listening may not remember. It was in 1993 and selected. There was a Union Jack, wasn't it? And
it was dropped in the back. So there was Brett from Suede on the front, and doing a Brett from Suede pose, and then behind it, Select dropped the Union flag, which I think obviously he was very unhappy about afterwards. But the idea, it said Yanks Go Home.
Yanks Go Home. That was it.
And inside there's an article. Well, there was lots of little individual
racial
from. So there was bits on Pulp and Saint Etienne, and I can't actually remember the other two. But there was like a few other little bands, not Blur, because we'd featured Blur before. Yeah. So like Suede, Saint Etienne, Pulp, and then there was a kind of overarching piece written by Stuart McConey, in which what he was saying was, look, grunge is all very well, and we like Nirvana. Everyone, I mean, you can't really deny Nirvana. Nirvana, great. But actually, we've got loads of good bands here, and why aren't we looking at the bands here? And so he kind of argued for Britpop without ever mentioning the word Britpop, which is kind of amazing. Because I was like, I'm sure he invent the term? And I read it, and I reread it, and I looked at it again, and I thought, am I right? It's not.
Who did then?
Who did? Yeah, come on.
Well, that's the difficulty. So you'll get people who say things like John Robb will say, I've invented Britpop. I used it in an article, pre that. But it didn't kind of mean that. And then there's an article by a guy called Cliff Jones in The Face, where he's interviewing Blur, and he uses the word Britpop about them. But then it kind of, something happened, and it just becomes completely universal parlance by the beginning of 94. In the beginning of 94, John Harris in the NME writes an entire article using Britpop all the way through. And we know what he means. We know he means Elastica, and he means Blur, and he means, we know everyone that he means. But it's that classic music journalist thing. Because if you think the time before that, we had kind of acid house and Manchester and shoegazing. Like, everyone was obsessed with naming things.
Yeah. Well, it's a journalistic
thing,
isn't it?
That celebrates itself.
Yeah. Yes. Lion Rock.
So mad. And so we were kind of obsessed with it. And that one worked. But the problem with that one is everyone hates it. Because calling anything Brit is quite difficult if you're not English. But especially difficult in Ireland, not great in Scotland or Wales. You don't really want to be called Brit. And actually, if you think about, say, punk bands will quite often like acknowledge that they're punk. No Britpop bands ever acknowledge that they're Britpop because it's a bit of a rubbish name. If we'd
It's
come
a
up with
terrible
a
name
better
because
one.
you make the point that nobody minded being called part of a punk band or a rave band or whatever because they were just quite attractive terms, weren't they?
But I suppose also if you're a band, a British band, the thing you want most is to mean something overseas, isn't it? And so if you're saddled with Brit, it suggests not for export, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, although that's also, I mean, I think that probably, if there's a certain kind of person in America who are going to love that.
Yeah, no, but it's
they're
quite
really
a small number of people. Yeah.
Niche.
What do you think the characteristics of Britpop were then? Because I don't know how you define it really.
Well, I would say, I mean, the part of the idea of the book is to expand it out, the notion of it, really, because the idea was to have almost like a select magazine idea of what was happening in the UK in music at that time. But the kind of quintessential Britpop, I would say, would be referencing slightly back to, in inverted commas, classic English pop. So you could say Bowie for Suede, you could say the Kinks for Blur, you could say the Beatles for Oasis. Do you know what I mean? Pulp actually are quite hard to pin down, I have to say. But you could say that those are references that kind of went through. And it was more an absolute kind of rejection of the I hate myself and I want to die angst and particular American guitar, jabbing guitar.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of rejection of that and a kind of an idea that what we had in the UK was something that could be celebrated, that actually we're really good at pop. So why not take some of that and use it? Do you know what I mean? And I would say, even things like Elastica, really you could say, they use The Fall quite a lot. And, there's just little references through that you would know. It's a little bit like what we were talking about before to do with knowing your music before. Do you know what I mean? And even things like the style. So secondhand style was incredibly important, not particularly to Oasis. They had a
I thought that was so interesting because you were talking about that, particularly as regards Jarvis, actually, that all those things you'd grown up with in the 70s, all those terrible toys and those kind of, the lamps and the kind of all the stuff, litter and stuff in your sitting room, had been kind of washed aside by the 80s, the kind of the matte black, kind of shiny 80s. And suddenly all that stuff came into vogue again, didn't it? The terrible flares and the cardigans and all the things that Jarvis wore.
Cheap.
And cheap.
Really cheap. Like I had a house and we had a secondhand rug, we had a lava lamp, we had a space hopper, we had all that stuff. And you would just get it. We had mugs that you would have had when you were younger because they would have been the ones that you saved up coupons for and got them from the local garage. Do you know what I mean? And all that stuff was in the charity shop. So if you were living in quite crappy flats, which we all were, I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel very grateful that we lived in an era where you could live in zone 2 of London and afford it. But the flats we were in were pretty grim. So you would just furnish it with whatever you could get from the secondhand shop, and all that stuff had been put in the secondhand shops because everybody had gone 80s.
For a very good reason.
One of the key figures you mentioned, which was brilliant, because I was trying to think who the kind of godfather of all this was, if there was one. And you mentioned Edwyn Collins, and I thought that was really interesting, because Edwyn Collins is such a significant character. He's the first kind of major kind of beta male pop star, wasn't he, in some ways?
Yeah, yeah.
And you say he kind of invented indie, and indie, in fact, begat Britpop.
Yeah, I was really keen to put him in, because, I mean, I loved Orange Juice, obviously, but also because I wanted to kind of explode the idea that he's a one-hit wonder, because I think he's really important, obviously. And there's a kind of another point that I wanted to put him in for, which I'll get to. But I think that obviously quite a lot of Britpop couldn't really have existed if it hadn't been for 80s indie. So 80s indie, and I would include, Orange Juice is a classic, things like the June Brides, even, Everything But the Girl, like that kind of interesting, tuneful, quirky pop. The Smiths is an obvious one. That was happening, but just outside the mainstream, like just outside, like The Enemy would cover it. It would get a bit in the smash hits, and it would go into, maybe if you were lucky, the top 10. and then it would immediately drop out because that was it. And we all knew they were great, but they never kind of got to a kind of mass audience. And the difference with Britpop was it was the same thing, but they got to a mass audience. And with Edwyn Collins, he had that really unusual hit in the middle of the 90s, which is A Girl Like You. And you think, oh yeah, Girl Like You. And you listen to that song, it's mad.
It's an amazing song.
It's a great song.
It's got a kind of Isley Brothers guitar solo in
Exactly. Isley Brothers is in there. It sounds like it should be in a Tarantino movie. It's such an odd thing. And they put it out. He had no record deal. He had no publishing deal. They put it out, and his wife was kind of his manager and doing everything. And it did okay, and then it just took off in Belgium and in Australia, and they couldn't stop it. They were getting all these phone calls and mad faxes, in the middle of the night going, we need more records. And they're like, oh my God, we've got to sign a distribution deal across all these different countries. And that song, that one song, and this is what I wanted to put in because I was wondering if younger, musicians might read it. Because they kept the publishing, that song has funded them for 30 years.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's been on movie soundtracks and all sorts of stuff, isn't it?
So this is one of the points that you mentioned in the book that I was quite interested in, is that quite a lot of the people you write about, the records you write about, turn out to be more successful than anybody expected. They uncover new levels of popularity, which is very much the story of what's happened in pop music in the last 30 years, isn't it? That when you have your comeback, you're playing in Wembley Stadium, not the arena, the bloody stadium. You know what I mean? The scale of these things grows all the time. But how do you account for that?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I remember I did an interview with, it's not quite the same, but it is the same. I did an interview with Albert from The Strokes, right? And I like The Strokes, amazing band, obviously, brilliant. But, they were kind of indie. And he said, we pay stadiums, we play arenas. He said, we don't do anything. We just get bigger. They're not doing anything. I mean, the Strokes quite often don't really get on with each other. So they're definitely not doing anything. It's just they get bigger. And I kept thinking about that when I was thinking about Blur and Oasis in particular, actually. Not so much with people like Suede, because Suede just reformed and kept playing. They just kept playing and they're really good. The Manics are the same. Suede stopped for a bit and then came back, but the Manics never really stopped. They just kept going and they're really, really good and they've got better and everyone thinks, okay, they're going to be a great night out. We will go and see them. But I think things like Blur, Oasis, maybe Pulp, people were like, these bands are really great and I can't see them. Like it's heartbreaking. I can't see these bands. Where are they? And then when they come back, people are like, oh my God, I love this album. I've never seen it. And it's all those people plus me who were like, well, obviously I like them and obviously I want to go and see Pulp. Why would I not? And then you're suddenly like, oh, it's quite hard to get tickets.
This is it.
What happened?
You talk about going to see Blur in Mile End, I think it is. And you then talk about going to see them again in Wembley Stadium. I just wondered if you could compare those two things. What had survived when you saw them in Wembley Stadium? What was still intact?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when I went to see them, both times you kind of thought, oh my God, they're really big, which is really hard to comprehend if you see a band, if you just rock up and see a band when they're young and you're just like, oh, well, there they are. We'll just go and see them again,
Yeah.
And so when they got to Mile End, I thought, oh my God, no, they're actually really big. And that, what I remember is literally the screaming. Like, I was like, oh, they're screaming at them. The classic move into pop territory, which I was quite surprised about. And they all seemed quite stunned at that point. And then when I went to Wembley, I thought it would be full of Blur fans, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. There was quite a lot of people who were dressed in a kind of generic Britpop way. So they had like a kind of bucket hat on and a band T-shirt. But that was, for me, it's a bit more Oasis-y.
But they're just people who go to Wembley, aren't they, really?
Exactly. They're just people who think, I like this band. It's going to be a good evening. It's Wembley. I can get there, come back. But then when you're there, because it's a stadium as opposed to a gig which goes out, you're surrounded by people singing.
I wanted to mention that. I wanted to mention this, because one of the things that struck me in the book is that sing-along was a huge part of Britpop, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he isn't really a part of British pop music prior to that, really.
No, but everyone does sing along. And some of those songs change when they're in that place. So Part Life, Girls and Boys.
Yeah.
In that environment, it's just people go, girls, boys,
yes,
boys, girls.
That's right. Yeah.
Like that. They just become kind of chants. And there's something really jolly about that. But they also played the songs that, I don't know, that, they played Trim Trab, which I really love. And they started playing it. And I was like, I took my daughter. She was very patient with me. And I went, oh my God, and stood up and started crying and waving like this. And of course, like everyone around me was just sat down because it was the boring one. I really love that track. Like I absolutely love it. Even thinking about it makes me want to cry. And they played it, and they played Out of Time, which I also love as well. So it's that thing where it is incredibly moving because it's obviously in the moment and your youth and all these things all at the same time, which is very hard to access, I think, other than through music, actually. To access your younger self and your everyday self at the same time. Like, I can't really think of any other way of doing it, actually. Really?
No, it's true. It struck me reading it again, reading your book, that how much Britpop depended to some extent on the press. I can't imagine it could have worked now because you got someone like Jarvis Cocker. Jarvis Cocker's a really good example. He was such a complicated and unconventional pop star, wasn't he? And he needed explaining. He needed a chance to be able to talk. And in fact, you get the impression that he becomes quite big almost before the group because he goes on, I think it's a pop quiz he went on as a TV quiz, and he's absolutely incredible on it and just wins everything, and he's very drunk and actually very charismatic, and he just kind of built a personality, didn't he, through just doing media and through doing press that really helped give the band some kind of identity. Do you think it could have happened in a world without the press?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think Jarvis is really interesting anyway, and that his is just a really long burn, isn't it? He's slow burn, through such a long time, and I think that the band really understood that actually he was something completely special, and eventually people would get him. But the music press, I think, is so interesting because obviously I work for Select, and Select, fantastic magazine, the best, and Select was like really. If you never knew it, it was a cross between the NME and Smash Hits, and it came out monthly. So we had posters, and we tried really hard with all sorts of aspects of it. But there was also the Inkies, there was the NME and Melody Maker and Sounds, but that kind of died in about 91, I think. So they came out every week, and they were incredibly, they just remind me of Twitter. Like when I read them, I never read them at the time because I wasn't, I was like Select and Smash Hits. And I read them and I thought, oh my God, they're like an early version of Twitter because... Yeah,
they're a constant debate, aren't they?
Constant debate. In each...
It's like sarky.
Yeah, waspish. And they're quite horrible, actually.
Yeah.
And each writer wrote as an individual, whereas I think as Select we wrote as a magazine.
Yeah.
And they wrote as an individual. So you get somebody going, the Manic Street Preachers are the best band ever. And then you get somebody going, I like hip hop and the Manics are absolutely terrible in the same magazine. And then the kind of readers would respond. And then also there was rivalries between NME and Melody Maker. So Melody Maker put Suede on the front of saying this is the best new band in Britain before they'd even released a single because they wanted to steal a march on NME. So it's like this constant chatter. And there was also Top of the Pops. I've actually just written a kind of side article about it because Rick Blacksill took over at Top of the Pops and he was really into all these bands. Yeah. And so he built different stages so they could perform, and he put them on before they even really broken the top 40 because he really liked them. So
you made the point about Radio 1 too, which I'd completely forgotten, that Matthew Bannister had become the new controller of Radio 1 in about, 93, I think.
Yeah.
So therefore he brought in all these new DJs who were looking for something new to play that announced to kind of got rid of all the old guard, hadn't he?
Exactly, got rid of DLT and Simon Bates and all those people. And so suddenly there really was a sense that that doors were opening, that if you pushed on those doors, they would open. And actually, of course, what had happened was that the bouncers had slightly changed, but he didn't really realize that you were just pushing those doors open. And then there was all these places where these bands could be seen. And, like any art scene, like whether it's, I don't know, the surrealists or whether it's like punk at CBGB's, you need lots of people who think who are kind of similar, but also like rivals, don't you? So you need them to kind of make their art, and then the next person think, that's really annoying. I could make mine. Mine's better. Put theirs out. And then, as they get older, they were all like, actually, we're all part of the same thing and we'd like each other. But at the time, you've got to have that kind of slightly niggly thing or nothing happens, You need Damon to fall out with Oasis.
Yes, that's true.
That, or like nothing will happen. You need someone to kind of argue it up. And I think obviously the music press were very good at that.
But also you got the tabloids at the same time, haven't you? Because they kind of pile into the same stuff, don't they?
Yeah, but that's interesting because in my time have worked, I've had a column at the Mirror and stuff like that. And I remember talking to Matt Kelly, who worked on the Mirror at the time of Britpop. And he said, we don't care about like the history of Blur. Like, we don't care that they've got better over time. What we care about is an event. And Blur versus Oasis in the singles chart, that's an event. Like, it's a news event. And they were convinced that Oasis was going to win because they're the Mirror. So they're like northern working class. Yeah. They just thought, obviously Oasis was going to win. And then they didn't. They were a bit miffed, but then they could kind of support them. Plus, Liam and Noel were really amazing. Like, they're amazing quote
machines,
monsters, aren't they?
And they loved talking to the press, which a lot of groups didn't up to that point.
Yeah, they really loved it. And also,
enjoyed it.
The other event, I think, was Jarvis and Michael Jackson. That's an event.
Yeah.
And like initially, all the tabloids were like, "Oh, this is terrible. These poor children were not
Michael Jackson.
Poor Michael Jackson." And then, literally, kind of.
Then they read the feeling in the room and thought, actually, people are rooting for Jarvis.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? It's the last hurrah of traditional media, isn't it? If you look at Top of the Pops, Smash Hits, The Enemy, then TFI Friday, Radio 1, all those things. Yeah. That's how you find out about those things, was through mass media.
Exactly. And then obviously the internet comes and the internet changes everything. Like, why would it not? It has changed everything. But yes, it was very, you don't know, how can anyone ever know that if you're living through a kind of prime time, you just think everything's great.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's only afterwards,
Yeah, you're like, we were lucky.
Yes, it was that wonderful old quote, a golden age is an age where things work in such a way as to make you think they will work this way forever.
Exactly that,
and it happens all the time. Yeah. Now, one thing my learned friends wanted to take up.
Yes. What could this be?
The title of your book, I feel I've heard before, but go on.
I'm sorry about this, Dave. But you are talking to a woman who called another book Out of Time. So
well, that's well used.
Yeah, exactly. So what happened was, with this book, if I'm honest, I was asked to do it and I left it for ages because I'm a deadline idiot. I can't do it in the time space. And it was meant to be handed in March. So, of course, I started work in March. And I just worked like a lunatic for kind of 3 months and wrote it in that time. So in that time, the publishers were having a fit, and they came up with a cover, which I instantly rejected. And they came up with I came up with titles, and they were like, look, you've mucked us around too long. We're going for this title. And I was like, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry, Dave.
But did you say this has been used before?
Well, I think it was used before I used it. Don't worry.
Exactly. I think it has been used a few times. But we have a different cover, Dave.
Right.
That's true. And a different author.
Don't worry.
Yes. Hopefully people will notice.
I know.
Well, either,
we must ask
honest,
about
if they buy
Oasis.
either, it's all right, isn't it?
We must ask about Oasis. Dave and I have a theory that Oasis are probably the most conservative band in British rock history. They're a band who constantly looking back, and it was all about the Kinks, and it's all about the Stones and T-Rex and the Beatles. And here they are. They come back 30 years later, and they won't change at all. They'll be wearing precisely the same thing. Their stage act still will consist of Noel staring rather sort of with furrowed brow at his fret work, while his brother sits on the drum riser drinking lager, and they just nothing will have changed. I mean, do you think that's true, that they're quite conservative?
I think it's really interesting because they're from Manchester. I'm from a suburb of Manchester. They are really mank. They're just really mank. And it's really hard to understand if you're not from Manchester, just what a huge gap that Stone Roses left.
Yeah.
The Stone Roses were absolutely in the heart of all Mancunian men. And when they went, there was just a gap.
Yeah.
And Oasis filled that gap, and the Verve also slightly filled that gap. And I do think they're conservative in one way, meaning that it's hard for them to acknowledge anything that isn't kind of classic in their minds. So, the Beatles are classic, and there's only certain bands that will pass their kind of quite rigid idea of what is a good band, right? But the one thing about Oasis, Noel in particular, is he actually went raving. And so he went to all the big places in Manchester, and he went to Thunderdome and stuff like that. And what I thought was interesting about Oasis, which I write about in the Chemical Brothers chapter a little bit more actually, is that he tried to write some rave songs at some point. And there's a couple of tracks where actually Oasis kind of trying to jam into a rave thing, which doesn't work because that's not what they're there for. But when you saw them, what they wanted to do was kind of bring that all togetherness. So they're like a little bit like the Stone Roses with a bit of rave in there. And it's not to do with the sound, it's to do with the community, of the people, of everybody there all joining in together. So I think you can say that they're conservative, but it's a bit more that, to me, that they're just classically northern. They're really northern. And even now, if you go to Manchester, there's a Mancunian style, there's a northwest style, it'll cross over to Liverpool, it'll be in Wigan. It's just a way that they dress. And it's slightly football-y, and it's slightly ravey, and it doesn't change. It's kind of classic northern, really. And I felt kind of almost reassured when I saw them, because I was like, oh, these are all the blokes that were around when I grew up. Do you know what I mean? Everybody was like that, really. And so I think, they are conservative, but they're also, they're classic, is what I would say. They're classic of their era, and they won't change because they are who they are. I don't know if you remember when they arrived, but obviously they'd done all their working out in Manchester, but they arrived, they were like they're fully formed.
Yeah.
Yes.
True.
And some bands do. Arctic Monkeys did that, didn't they? They arrived and you were like absolutely fully formed. They were perfect.
Ready to go.
They were and ready to go. And they're the similar kind of band.
So that's an interesting point. Why are Oasis so famous and the Arctic Monkeys are not?
The Arctic Monkeys are really famous
they're immensely popular.
My daughter's age group, yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Huge. AM is like an absolutely classic album, but I would say, they're not as press friendly. Like Alex Turner is definitely press friendly. If you talk to lots of journalists, they don't really like Alex Turner. They always find him very difficult. Right. Whereas Oasis, like Noel and Liam, I mean, I think it was, I interviewed them just before What's the Story, and it was impossible to interview Liam, actually. I was meant to interview them both, and they just couldn't pin him down. But Noel was always brilliant. And even now, Liam is so funny. He's so funny on Twitter. He's such a funny interview.
He is. He's hilarious.
His insults are just brilliant.
Yeah.
He called, calling Chris Martin a plant pot. I mean, that's just...
Yeah.
They're not guarded. They're not guarded in any way, are they? Whereas everybody else is quite guarded.
Yeah, you don't feel anyone's advising them. They don't have to check anything with anyone before they post it.
No, absolutely not. And also, there's a thing where I just feel like, which is possibly what Noel's approach, and I think Liam does it maybe more instinctively, where they're just like, yes, I take drugs. Do you want to hear about it? Yes, I get hammered. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's nothing hidden. You can't get me. I am who I am. And that's quite hard for a lot of, it's hard for anyone, isn't it? To step into completely who you are and go accept it.
Yeah.
And obviously some people are going to hate you.
I was really interested by the variety of all the bands. You kind of forget because, with kind of the beat movement or psychedelia or whatever, or metal, there tended to be a conformity and lots of groups wanted to appear as like each other as possible. But the variety is incredible. You got Richard Ashcroft, who seems to be a kind of 70s rock star who won't ever go out unless he's dressed with, he's got the shades on, And then you've got people like Radiohead who couldn't be more different from Supergrass, whatever. And there's a point you made about Radiohead, which I'd never realised, that they were offered a deal I think in 1987 by Ireland. And they said, no, we don't want a record deal. What we're going to do is we're going to stop and we're all going to go to university. And we're going to meet back here in 3 or 4 years' time. And they didn't then get a deal till whatever it was, 1991, and put a record out in 92. See, I couldn't think of any other group who had that kind of hunger to succeed. Then thought, actually, no, we're all going to go to college.
I think it was because Tom wasn't sure if he wanted to do art or not. So he kind of went off and did a bit of art. And they kept coming back at the weekends, like once a month or so, and they come back and just think, shall we rehearse? You know, we'll all come back from all their various different unis and come back and they and kind of think, well, yeah, it seems we still seem to quite like this. It seems to be going quite well. So maybe we'll get a record deal.
Just so unusual.
I know. I do, yeah.
Do you think there'll be another, Dave and I were talking about this the other day, that apart from Coldplay, and Coldplay are a kind of household name, and yet most people can't even mention.
I did a thing.
Don't even know
I did a thing at
Coldplay
Bookshop the other day. I said, I will give money to anybody who can name all of Coldplay, and nobody could do it.
Nobody can. So it's interesting that Oasis were the last. Yeah. But Oasis were the last big household name. Really? Do you think there'll be another, or do you think there's ever going to be a chance there's be another movement like that? Because I can't imagine there will be.
I think that, no, I do think there are movements. You could say that indie sleaze was a movement. You could say that grime is a movement. You know, you can definitely do that. It's just that we don't have the outlets to write about them. I always think, you know, people
it's
are very...
It's the mass media.
People are very rude about writers, and I think sometimes rightly so. But... you know, why is Manchester so revered amongst in music? It's because we had the writers. Like Birmingham made some good music, but nobody wrote about it. You know, like we had mythologizers like, you know, Paul Morley, like Tony Wilson. You know, in Manchester, you need the mythologizers to say this is a movement. You know, and there has been a little bit about grime, I think, actually, but you know. I often miss things like smash hits, you know. I mean, you know, I'm old. I miss smash hits. I miss Top of the Pops. But I miss those things because they're simultaneously really democratic and they make sense of things. So, you know, you have like, if you had smash hits or select and you had someone like, I mean, Stormzy does it anyway, but like, you know, you had someone like Stormzy in there. He's just such a great pop star. Like, I'm so sad that Smash Hits didn't exist for him. Do you know what I mean? He's so brilliant. And there's so many actually excellent pop. So look at all the new women that have come on. Like, you've got Charlie XCX, you've got Billie Eilish, you've got Sabrina Carpenter. You know, you've got all these people that are perfect for Smash Hits. So we have no Smash Hits. It drives me mad.
But it's not just Smash Hits.
Saturday morning TV.
No, well, that's the point. It's not just Smash Hits is very important, but it's not just Smash Hits. It's the daily papers. It's the weekly television programs. It's the sense of a story being told to you as it's happening.
Exactly.
It doesn't happen anymore. Yeah.
You know?
No, that's very hard because it does happen to a certain extent, but it happens in a slightly more niche way. So I think, like, if you look at, say, do you know that the chicken shop interviews? They're really good, and like they have all the stars on there, and she does absolutely brilliant interviews.
Yeah, she has.
And so I kind of feel like almost if I want to know about a pop star, I'll go and search that up because you'll get more out of that than anything else, really, because it's so fun and she's really, really good at interviewing. But it's a very individualistic thing, isn't it?
It is very. And if you'd sat there in the glory days and Smash Hits and tried to predict in 30 years' time the function of this magazine will be taken by this woman interviewing people you've probably never heard of in a chicken shop.
Yeah, but really well. She does it so well. I love it.
She's done incredibly well.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, I do. I mean, you know, it's built into us to miss certain things from our past, really. But there's a lot of stuff, you know, I can blame us as well. Like, so what I would also say is that we argued very much at that time, and I very much believe it, that music is important. Music is really, really important, I think. And we won that argument. So, like, you know, you go into a shop, you'll hear really unusual kind of music on there. It'll be used in brands. It's used everywhere. And we won that argument so much that people now think it's a right. They think it's like water. Like music should be free and it should be available all the time. We won that argument. But because they think it's like a right, not a privilege, it's worth financially less. It's worth more in that, like, we all know that we should all have it all the time, but it's worth financially less. So it's a bit like we sold it so hard that it's hard you can't make money out of it anymore. And that's the difficulty with winning that argument. People are like, of course I need music and of course I need it all the time, but I'm not going to pay for it because it's like water. Why would I?
You divided up the book into 20 songs and 20 songs from the kind of your own Britpop kind of soundtrack. You know, which of those has the most resonance for you? Can you pick one of those tracks?
Well, they change a lot. I mean, that's the problem with it. So, I mean, you know, it depends what mood I'm in. You know, if I'm feeling kind of wishy and romantic, I would say The Wild Ones by Suede. And I think it's really hard to argue against Common People. Like, how could you ever argue against that? So, like, the perfect
It is a masterpiece.
It's an absolute masterpiece. But then Setting Sun by the Chemical Brothers induces some kind of feeling in me that I don't think I get from any other record.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. It's hard for me to pick. We had arguments about the songs as well, as you can imagine. So, you know, the publisher was like, why are you choosing Slide Away from Oasis? Because I was like, it's the ladies' classic. We all love it. Everyone loves Slide Away. I am correct. So, like, it depends what mood you're in. It's I find it really hard. You know, Desert Island Discs is an impossible thing, isn't it? Absolutely impossible.
Nightmare.
Terrible.
Thank God I've never been asked to be on it. I mean,
I know, that's why we need the internet.
We do, precisely.
Well, look, it's all in there.
It is.
It's all in the book called Uncommon People. Remember that title.
Yes.
Remember that title and buy a book with that title.
Yes, buy all the books with that title.
Today we're recommending this one in particular. And all of them.